Well, thank you for joining us today. My name is Christina Bogdanou. I am the director of the Kalogira Center for Modern Greek Studies at Loyola Marymount University. And it is a real pleasure to welcome all of you to today's conversation with Professors Gregory Jusdanis and Peter Jeffries, the co-authors of the much anticipated Constantine Cavafy new biography, the first major reassessment of Cavafy's life in nearly 50 years. The biography has been long listed for the National Book Critics Circle Award, one of the three top national literary prizes in the United States, and has also won the Kostas and Eleni Iourani Prize for Biography in Greece, awarded by the Academy of Athens. So allow me to introduce our speakers, both leading experts in the work of Cavafy. Dr. Gregory Jusdanis, a distinguished arts and sciences professor at The Ohio State University, is a leading scholar of modern Greek studies, widely known for his influential work on modernity, nationalism, and cultural Greek identity. He's the author of several books, just to name a few: The Poetics of Cavafy, Belated Modernity and Aesthetic Culture, and The Necessary Nation. Dr. Jusdanis has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dr. Peter Jeffries is an associate professor of English at Suffolk University in Boston. He has written, translated, and edited several books on Cavafy. And again, just to name a few: C.P. Cavafy Selected Prose Works, Reframing Decadence, Cavafy's Imaginary Portraits, Eastern Questions, Hellenism, and Orientalism in the Writings of E.M. Forster. Professor Jeffries is a member of the International Cavafy Archive Academic Committee at the Onassis Foundation and served as consultant for the exhibits at the Cavafy House in Alexandria and the Cavafy Archive Space in Athens. Before we start, I would also like to extend a warm thank you to the Consul General of Greece in Los Angeles, Christina Valosopoulou, for her generous support of our events and for being with us today. And of course, I want to thank everyone in our audience who have joined us today to learn about the life, the work, and the enduring legacy of Constantine Cavafy. Time permitting, we will have a short Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions in the Q&A section of your screen. And I think we're ready to start. So welcome again.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and hello to everybody.
Thank you.
So I would like to start with the obvious question. Why this biography now? And I don't know, who.
I'll let Peter start because it was his idea originally, and he was the one that invited me. So Peter.
I guess the credit and the blame, I guess. So that's how it works. No, I had thought, as working on Cavafy, we had such limited biographical. We were constantly going back to Little, which was it is a fine biography, but it just seemed to me it was so, I wouldn't say dated necessarily, but it was lacking. It was just sort of oversighted, and it didn't, for me anyway, it didn't really bring him to life. So I thought, okay, time for a new biography, and I asked Gregory his thoughts and invited him, and he kindly agreed, and that was the beginning of the spark that set this all up.
I guess one of the first things that your readers notice is that you do not organize the biography chronologically, what one would expect, but thematically. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that choice and
Right. So
how?
usually biographies are written chronologically from cradle to grave. And we thought of writing it thematically for three reasons. First of all, it was easier to share the work thematically, that Peter would do these chapters, I would do these chapters, although we obviously went over each other's writing. So that was easier to do than to say that I will do 0 to age 45 and Peter will do 45 until the death. The second is that his life was really uneventful, in that after a while he spent most of his life in Alexandria, other than Gauguin, who is a biography also published this year, who had an extraordinary life traveling to Latin America, back to France, the far Pacific. And third, because we feel that it was easier to, in a sense, generate and moderate the narrative flux and the narrative arc. In writing a chronological biography, you're very much determined by the time itself, the years of the life. Whereas if you shape it, the chapter thematically, then you're able to, in a sense, generate that arc to fit. So you always, in a sense, can end in a more transcendent note for the reader than you can in a chronological biography. And I think since a biography is by definition written for a more general audience, we felt this lent itself for this type of writing. So for those three reasons.
Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would add, I mean, to those very important sort of informing notions, it allowed us a lot of flexibility. And so, and that's always a good thing. It also allowed us to sort of tell a story a little bit more creatively. And there were a lot of voids in the archives, so we didn't have the sort of letters and diaries and things that a lot of people kept. I mean, there were extraordinary documents there, but it wasn't the sort of archive that would lend itself to this sort of chronologically exhaustive treatment from A to Z. So those were two other factors. And it really, once we got started with it, the flexibility was just a wonderful thing. It allowed for us to be creative and also to bring kind of a different intimacy to writing the biography that way.
Mhm. Um, I think that in your introduction, you described Cavafy, and I quote, a master self-promoter managing his own reputation with obsessive finesse until the final weeks of his life, end of quote. So you mentioned the gaps and the silences in the historical record, the undisclosed aspect of his life, which many were very deliberate, especially regarding his private life. How did you work with that? I mean, where do you draw the line between illuminating his private world in a biography, as you should do, and respecting his intentional silences?
Well, some of those silences were not of his own. They were missing documents, perhaps documents that were removed, that were pilfered, or in a sense, silences because nobody chose to speak about these topics. So this is a question that comes up in biography: as to what extent can you then respect the wishes of a particular author to a particular silence? And I would think my answer to that is, after a while, especially when the person is dead, that your duty is less to the author than to the reader, and that you try to write a compelling and interesting and insightful story for the reader, and you have to then be upfront about the silences and the gaps that exist. That some may be there by accident, some deliberate, and then you can discuss them in that way.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think, the challenge too for both of us was to be respectfully um, creative, but also, to maybe take a bit of a risk in extrapolating from these silences. And something that, is very prominent is the whole notion of intimacy, the human being behind the performance, because we have this sort of creation that Cavafy sort of promoted towards the end of his life of the eccentric, this sort of interesting, odd poet, etc. But we really needed to get beneath and behind that to find the human being. And so, we did rush into some of those gaps and to create a story. And I think from judging from well, many of the readers tell us and have written that they found that strategy effective because for many it's the first time they felt that they get to know a human being, something a little bit more than this ossified production and construction of Cavafy that we've received for so many years.
And just to add to that, I think that's what a biography is, that you want to go and provide insights into the contradictions of the life and to provide insights into the inner self that exists behind then the performance. And the performance is always there, as there is for us. We have now a performative role at this moment, and also the historical record that had survived that was also a product of other interpreters. So this was our attempt to read that private life and provide explanations to it, and also for the poetry on the basis of what existed, what others said, and also our interpretation of new material that had arisen in the Cavafy archive after it was made public by and purchased by the Onassis Foundation.
Mhm. I mean, obviously, you're experts in his work. You have been, studying him, writing about him for many years. Was there anything new, anything surprising when you went back to the archives?
Peter's a greater expert than me. He has written more, so he could start.
Well, I won't say that anything surprised me, although both Gregory and I were delighted to see that Rika Singopulu had begun a biography and had left notes which were intriguing, and we made much of those in the book. Um, the intensity of the letters, I knew about them, but to sit and study them systematically and thoroughly, his relationship with his brothers for me was just, so fascinating, particularly with his brother Paul, who spent the last 10 years of his life in France and had rather a sad story. The intensity of those exchanges and how the brothers really both, supported each other, but also there was an odd competition there too. I mean, he was the youngest of the siblings, so seven brothers. That's a tall order. And I think he had to shoulder the weight of all of this family. Um, I don't know, maybe trauma to some extent because the family underwent economic trauma and just transitional trauma. So for me, one of the more intriguing things was just to really see how these letters, which again, there were gaps because we didn't have Cavafy's letters to his brothers. That's the sad thing. So we had to extrapolate. So the sort of juggling and filling the gaps there was very challenging and illuminating for me.
Mhm.
For me, what it was when people ask me what I learned from the biography, being preoccupied and entering the mind of this individual for so many years, was an opportunity to communicate with genius, with this great mind. And what was surprising to me was because I expected always then to be uplifted by into the heavens or into the sky, into the stars with his genius, and how much he was preoccupied with the little things in life. I mean, in the biography, we devote a long section to all the lists that he kept, lists and lists, giving himself directions, what type of bread they brought, who made the coffee. And so the question that I had is, why? Why did he preoccupy himself with these sort of minor matters? I expected him naively always to be dealing with poetry, and yet, like everybody else, he had his life to lead. And this probably just helped him organize his life. And so that was really what surprised me the most.
It's interesting because many critics see Cavafy through his work as the master of restraint. So you wouldn't really expect to find all those meticulous lists about all those mundane, everyday things, right?
The pettiness by which he pursued a loan that his brother, that he had lent, I mean, over the years and not letting it go, you'd think again, he would preoccupy himself with greater things other than this really petty matter, that went on over, I think, over 12 years, and writing and rewriting over and over again. But that, I think, is also the human side, the contradiction in the personality, because we have this idealized picture that has come out since his death, and yet there is a human being that has to deal with life's problems in an everyday way, like everybody else does. So what comes out here is also his humanity, that maybe, yes, he was a genius, he was a great mind, he influenced the fate of Greek poetry, but at the end of the day, he had to buy bread and he had to take care of his finances.
You needed a shopping list, right?
Yeah, he
Uh,
lists and lists.
and again, when you write about such an admired, persona, the poet, the celebrated poet, it's interesting how to handle the balance, the sensitive balance between, you know, maintaining that admiration and being critical of, the things that you discover. And so, did you have those moments where you had to question yourself, should I include this or should I not? Does it go against like the admired persona that everybody's expecting to read in even in a biography?
I think we had to correct a couple of over stated or overdeveloped ideas about him as being paranoid and being somewhat manipulative. And not that those things weren't there. I mean, all human beings have that level, but he had really, in the final decades, particularly his one arch critic, Malanos, Timos Malanos, had really sort of created almost a grotesque exaggeration of who he was. And for me, anyway, and both Gregory and I were conscious of working against the grain of these received ideas, but we had to break down some of these overstated and I think unfair stereotypes that people had, sort of overlaid him with. And so we that was the first thing. And then, how far do you go? I mean, you can't simply dismiss and erase them because there were grains of truth here and there to all of these things. And Gregory mentions genius. I would add to that, his courage. He was a very courageous writer and had an extraordinary belief in his own abilities. So um, it's easy to see that as arrogance or pride or manipulation, but a better way is to sort of rethink it in terms of his humanity and what he deserved in terms of a story and a life story. So I think there's a middle ground in what you say, to find a middle path. And, I think we accomplished that, or we tried to accomplish that.
Yeah, I would add to that as well that in a biography, and we were very conscious of this, of treading this line between the hagiography and the hagiogram,
Yeah.
and trying to be both respectful to, in a sense, to put it simply, the good and the bad. And this comes out. So after the biography was published, Peter and I went on our separate paths in doing readings, etc. So in the readings that I had given, I came up always with people expressing some resistance and some dismay and some disappointment at having to find out that how much he promoted his own career and how much he ended up using and manipulating others in order to push his sort of fame forward. And many times people just expressed disappointment, not in the biography, but in having to learn about this because they had formed this idealized image. And I said, what impact though does it have? Because if we look at great people, at anybody, whether it's Stephen Jobs or anybody that has done great things, they're not necessarily nice people. And is that relevant to their work and our evaluation of them? I don't think so. What we're gaining here is a more balanced picture of the poet. And if he was not always nice or pleasant, in a sense, it's irrelevant to our own reception of the work. I mean, he wasn't a criminal. It's not that he, is like some people, was a Nazi collaborator. Obviously, that's anachronistic. So it's just that he was using and manipulating other people. So I found many, many people just resisted or expressed their disappointment in having to discover that their idealized image, this person was capable of doing that. So that was really interesting. It came up in these discussions.
Um, I think that unless you have anything else to talk about what you discover about his life, would you be interested in talking a little about what you learn about his work? Anything that, because again, as scholars of Cavafy's work, you have spent a lot of time exploring, examining his poetry. Um, any new discoveries, any new insights about how you see him now as a poet?
Peter, I mean, you devoted, as I said, so much time to him.
Yeah, well, I think I've always, I didn't have any, I mean, I didn't have this eureka moment where I changed my way of reading him. So I bring a lot of my uh, own scholarly background into the biography. So and I have a very definite sense of him as an Anglo-Greek, and his years both in London and Liverpool, and then those crucial years in Istanbul, where we make the point that this was the place where he decided to write in Greek, because there was still an open question. Why did he write in Greek? He could have written in English, or he, could have been explored other languages. Those sort of formative urban moments where he's in these cities that impact him, I think really sort of changed the way I viewed him. Just, we begin with the 154 poems, and everybody reads Cavafy, and we know all the greatest hits. But to go back to those early years when he's reworking and reshaping the language, his own language, and just to really study that was fascinating for me. We make a big point of his rejecting so much of what he wrote, but for me, I'm always salvaging these rejected poems. I have a book on his relationship with decadence, and I see him very much coming out of, those European trends, which people have said there's nothing new about that, but you have to sort of take a stance on that and read his poems with a certain trajectory. And the other thing I would add, just going back a little bit to what Gregory said about people's, maybe disappointment at him being manipulative. I think it's today we can think about Cavafy as this, global presence, but in the final years of his life, there was no surety for this. I was just looking at I picked up at a house sale a volume of the Atlantis New York newspaper from 1929, and in every edition they had three Palamas poems in there.
Mm.
Palamas was the king of poetry, and this is what he was struggling against.
Mhm.
And so I think it's easy for us to sort of look at and say, okay, well, Cavafy was a genius, and he manipulated and he orchestrated his reputation. But that was a very difficult task that he had to deal with in those final years of his life. So, he either had to create a readership for which he launched himself in the next 100 years, and this is what he did. So that whole trajectory of his poetic revision of himself to create this final voice that we identify today as Cavafy. This is the extraordinary thing.
Right. I think I will just pick up where Peter ended, that he faced all these odds. Not only was his poetry, in a sense, rejected to a certain extent by the Athenian readership because everybody was talking about Palamas, he had then the whole sexual, the homoerotic, the homosexual, the gay, queer poetry to contend with, and his fear of how that would be received. The fact that he was living in a provincial city. I mean, by provincial, obviously, we all know that Alexandria was cosmopolitan, but it wasn't the center of literary production in the way that London and Paris was. He was never part of what, in theory, we call the interpretive community, like sort of Weimar during Goethe's time, when one person was helping and promoting the other. So, in order to connect in that question to what you asked, Christina, so what I picked up from this is his own sense of steadfast commitment to his poetry and his task. So in order to write the biography, we had to create a story, and the story that could easily be dispensed, say, in the introduction, in the outside of the book, which is someone abandons love in order to promote himself. And that might be very simplistic, but it's what you need, in a sense, for the promotion of the book. But there is a kernel of truth to that story, in that I think when he saw the failures of his brother's poetry, he saw the decline of his own family, his own inability to form, or lack of luck, in a sense, in his life to form a permanent, intimate relationship, made him really turn towards his poetry, and poetry became his reason for being. And if he had not done this, and if he had not then promoted this, and he had not done, as Peter said, to create readers one at a time, he would not have been able to fight against all those incredible forces that were pushing in the other direction, and we wouldn't be having this seminar today, because there wouldn't be Cavafy. There could have been someone who had written the poems, but they wouldn't be known in the way that they are known now, and had it not been for that original effort, in a sense, to push beyond the gravity that was holding him back. And then after, as we say in the book, after the death, he has no control of this at all. It's other forces that pick up and create the Cavafy that we know.
Well, you mentioned Alexandria, right? You mentioned his status as an outsider often to the literary establishment in Athens, his status in Alexandria. I mean, it seems like place is a very important part in his narrative, in your narrative also. You spent enough time talking about Alexandria, the place, the city. Would you care to comment on how Alexandria shaped Cavafy's identity, his imagination, his poetry?
Well, he turned, like Joyce with Dublin, Alexandria into both a theme and a place. So it was just inevitable. It almost exists in every poem. Alexandria is present in the poems about modern individuals, and also in ancient Alexandria. And as other people have said beforehand, like Keeley and others, that he really turned Alexandria into a metaphor. What we did for the first time is actually have him walk around and ramble through Alexandria. And we were very pleased that with the first review that came out actually had chosen this, that here we had him living, going to shops, going to cafes, going to the theater. So we actually placed him for the first time in Alexandria as a living human being rather than just a metaphor.
Peter?
Yeah, I think my interests are a little bit outside of Alexandria, so I was a little more focused on London and how Istanbul as sort of alternatives. But I mean, the idea of the city and urbanity is central to everything that he writes. And he becomes this flaneur, this urban stroller. And the thing about Alexandria is that the antiquities were not there, and he was hard pressed to summon them and reimagine them. And we make quite a bit of that in the book, that he had to sort of supply these past antiquities, whereas in Istanbul they were there. Byzantium, he could see it and touch it. In Athens when he visited too, of course, but in London he had museums that he could visit, so he has a sense of these. There wasn't really that sort of thing, so he really it challenged his imagination to sort of recreate something and create his own idea of what Alexandria became for him.
Just to follow up on Peter, she was really then the poet of the urban space. And he has that very famous poem, Thalassae Proiou, The Morning Sea, in which he says, as much as I try to observe, to behold the sea, I really can't. Because every time I try to look at the sea, what do I see? I see my own desires, my own visions of pleasures, i.e., I cannot write about nature as I did in those rejected poems. I can only write about myself as a person living in a city. And that's what I think perhaps explains his modernity and his popularity, because he doesn't write about, in a sense, Zorba, the rural figure. He writes about the person that's living in the city, where most of his readers are.
And I would add too, I mean, for Alexandria was, a mixed blessing for him. He settled there. He often questioned whether he should have left. It became home by default, in a sense. Um, and when he has, of course, one of his other signature poems, Hippolis, the city, he makes the point that, you can't escape the city. If you ruin your life in this city, anywhere you go, you'll ruin your life there as well. And I think that that's just sort of the price he had to pay on some level for becoming such an urban poet. I mean, it was very much a mixed blessing for him. So Alexandria offered him the place to reimagine himself, but it was also limiting to the extent that, it was a conservative, cosmopolitan, commercial city, and he had to sort of bring art up into the higher levels, and that's why, of course, he was able to do it. There wasn't a lot of competition there in some way. So he had the field to himself, and he did remarkable things. He became the poet of the city, and you know, he played that angle very well later in his life, particularly. Everybody, came to see him. But I think on some level he might have had a little fatigue with Alexandria. And today, of course, when you go to the remnants, and his apartment has been recently redone in an extraordinary way, you get a sense of what perhaps he was anticipating, which was just the absolute collapse of the Greek cosmopolitan presence there, and we also are, attentive to what his sensibilities were to the Egyptian Arab population. So we have quite a bit of attention to that, which Gregory might want to speak to as well, because Alexandria was a very mixed thing for him.
Yeah, just to pick up again what Peter was said, that it was a mixed blessing. When he came to Athens in 1932 for treatment for his throat cancer, he was visited then by a man named Lapithiotis, who was open as a gay poet, and they had a conversation in the hotel room before the operation. And Cavafy, Constantine said, I'm really sort of admiring of you because you've lived an open life as a, he didn't say it, but if we can say in quotation marks, as a gay man, he said, I lived in a conservative city where people always see through the keyhole. So that personally, you could say that he suffered in that respect. Had he lived in London or Paris, he might have been able to come out in that way. However, in terms of art, we gained by his decision to stay in Alexandria and say not go to Athens, because he was forced to think about himself and think about his connection to the current city, the modern city, and the ancient city. And he was able then to write this incredible poetry because he said, as he said to another visitor, a consul general from Greece, that it was because it didn't have the celebrated antiquities of Athens. It was a blank slate for him to express his own originality. So I would say, had he gone to Athens or Paris or London, I doubt that we would have the poetry that we have today. He might have been a happier person, but he wouldn't have been the same poet. So again, it's the cruelty on our part that we're interested really in the poetry rather than the poet, and we profit by the fact that he was unhappy. I mean, it's a paradoxical way that we readers are, and the way that we look at the person and the work. We're interested mostly in unhappiness and what a person does with that unhappiness.
Yeah, and I would just follow up to say that, there's a sort of an alchemy that he applies to Alexandria, and it's precisely because of what it lacked that he's able to create something else. Baudelaire does this with Paris, but Paris had so much that Baudelaire could barely keep up with it. That was the opposite case with Cavafy and Alexandria, particularly because he had to convert it into something, and that challenge, was there, and he rose to it magnificently in some ways.
Um, we have a couple of questions from the audience, so I think I'm just gonna go to them, and then we can continue a little bit
Right.
with some other questions in case we run out of time and we do not address them. We have a question from Kostas Dalegiorgas. So he says, "Are you hopeful of finding any new Cavafy documents, either letters or poems, in the future?"
Well, the only thing I can say is I found one by accident in when I was in Amsterdam recently, and that was a letter that was written to a German newspaper that had published beforehand two poems, a translation of Cavafy poem Helmut von den Stein, and this was the young assistant that had treated him in the sanatorium. Nobody knew of its existence, but these are very, very few. I don't think that we would be able to find. I mean, they can always exist, but nothing revelatory. I think not in the archive. It could be somebody in somebody's closet in somebody's basement, but nothing major in the archive. The archive has been gone through now in so many ways that there's nothing new there that is going to be dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, I fantasize about someone coming up with all Paul's, the brother Paul, who's we don't know where his, you know, possessions when he died, a pauper in Hyères in France. Maybe they'll turn up. Imagine if we
Yeah,
find all that stuff.
yeah.
It's possible. It's possible that somewhere in some attic or in some and there are some things that I think, he had some correspondence with George Velasopoulos that could still turn up somewhere. So it is possible that we will get some new things.
The second part of Costa's question is, while doing your research and writing about Cavafy's life and times, what was the most surprising or unexpected thing you learned about him? Wasn't something.
Well, for me, again, it was something that I still remember, and I don't think I'll ever forget when I went early on into the archive, when it existed still in paper form, that the assistant there, who was very helpful to us, Angeliki Musiu, pointed to the notes, handwritten notes. So after the operation, he had lost his capacity to speak, and people who knew him said this was really just something tremendous to listen to him speak, both his voice, his accent, peculiar accent, and the way he formulated his sentences. And one particular note that he wrote to Rika Sengopoulos, who was, in a sense, his literary heir, and the woman, along with her husband, who took care of him. They lived in the apartment below. And he wrote to her what seemed like a note of apology for his treatment of her, because in a sense he always posited his own self-importance before anybody else. In those final days, in the swiggly writing of an old man who was dying, he recognized her also as a poet and said that my tears are proof of my own sincerity, that I am, in a sense, apologizing right now. And that was for me a moment like that. I still remember, and I remember going back to the Airbnb and trying to determine how Rika, in those final days, would have reacted to this revelation, to the receipt of this sort of intimate and tender note that she had never heard before. It was like another person speaking at that moment.
Yeah, I would a little different angle for me. He was a professional letter writer in his position at the municipality, the Third Circle of Irrigation. And in my early work was with his letters with E.M. Forster, which were very dry and rather laconic and to the point. But when you go and look at just sort of earlier letters and sort of his more emotional side, it's fascinating to see that he had a very wide range of, and he was very focused on letters. I mean, he would write a draft before he would write a second letter, and thank God, because many of the things we have are simply the drafts, so we can kind of trace what he actually sent and wrote. So his as an epistolographer, his role as a letter writer it was always fascinating to me. But really going through so many of these letters, and we thank God we had them, because we couldn't have had this biography without them. And that's why we also opted to reproduce so many of them in the biography verbatim, and translated. That to me is just part of the richness of, thank God, what we have and what survived in the archive.
We have a couple of questions more. So Nikos Frangas says, "Good morning. Thank you for the seminar today. Talent is the heart of what a creator does, but visibility is the key to unlocking opportunities." So we're going back to some of your previous comments. Oh, wait. I just lost that. Just give me a second if I can find. Okay. So he says, talent is the heart of what the creator does, but visibility is the key to unlocking opportunities. So it is absolutely obvious that he wanted to be read. Could you elaborate on Cavafy being described as manipulative, quote unquote? A couple of examples would help. So I understand that this characterization comes from his contemporaries rather than from his biographers. Calling Cavafy manipulative without unpacking how he manipulates feels a little vague to be useful and risks sounding like a moral judgment rather than a description of craft.
Well, I think then that's an opportunity to read the biography, because so what we mean by manipulative is the way that he, in a sense, used the young men that he knew to turn them into apostles who would spread the message. And this was said, this was in a sense realized, and his contemporaries realized this, that his genius lay not in forming a little group of Cavafy poets and Cavafy artists, but in persuading people to become fanatical followers. And they did, and they spread the message to all corners of Egypt, Greece, and Europe. This is not a moral judgment. It's an observation, as we tried before, in the way that he tried to fight against the forces that were working against him. It's a very complex argument that neither Peter and I can reproduce right now, other than just to explain it generally in this way.
Yeah, another minor anecdote that we have in the book with Timos Malanos, who did make it a moral judgment. I mean, he was very critical in saying that it was manipulative in a kind of excessive way. But he has an anecdote that he showed Cavafy one of his early poems, which were somewhat imitative, because the process was imitation, parody, and then full admiration from many of his readers. But Cavafy goes through the poem and says, this is Cavafy and this is not Cavafy, and this is Cavafy and this is not Cavafy, and then forces Malanos to change the poem. And then by the end of the mentoring session, or the revision workshopping, whatever we want to call it, it's this very Cavafian poem. So Malanos, I mean, whether this is true, who knows? But this was Malanos sets this critique as him being not as a master manipulator.
And just to add two more examples, we begin that chapter with Cavafy arriving in Athens for the operation. All the literati of Athens come to visit him, including a man, Katsimbalis, who had written a bibliography of all the work that was written by Cavafy. Now, you'd think that Cavafy, being overwhelmed with pain and the fact that he had come for this operation, would not worry about this, but he took Katsimbalis to the side and said, Katsimbalis, are you sure you have sought all the titles that have been written about me? So therefore, I suggest that you change the title of that incomplete somehow, that to give the sense that it's incomplete, that there's no possible way you could have gathered all the titles that have been written on me. He looked after his reputation as if he had been his own agent, as if he had been his own publicist. And this was years before Hollywood and what we learned about how, in a sense, you promote his work. And that's not a bad thing. I admire him for that. It's just that he had to do this in order to promote his career and promote this original poetry that otherwise would have just been forgotten and ignored in Alexandria.
And it was protective as well, because let's not forget the fact that he was very vulnerable to the queer content of his writing. And this was something that there was no sure way to, dispel the criticism there. So it was a very difficult position that he was in, defending himself morally, artistically, philologically, and also, socially as well. I mean, that was part of the readership in Alexandria. It was a very social thing going on there when people interacted with him, and he gave them poems and, circulated to people he trusted in a sense.
Thank you. We have one question from Fokion Kolaidis. He says, do you have an explanation as to why Cavafy's poems were not published in book format during his lifetime?
Peter?
Yeah, I think I mean, I like to go back to this sort of aristocratic notion that he carried over from the 19th century and from his own sense of being from the protoclassati and coming from sort of artistic high class, that it was really déclassé to publish to have a book like that published. You published your own books and circulated them, so he might have resisted it on that level. But he was never satisfied and finished writing, and cancer took him out prematurely. So it might have been timing. It might have been that he was never, he never could resist revising to the very end. It was a compulsion, almost a neurosis, which, I mean, if you think we don't even have a scholarly edition of his poems that have all the revisions. I mean, that's the other scandal of Cavafy philology in Greece, I would say. There's some people were supposed to do it and they haven't done it. So that is still waiting to happen. So we can see all of the emendations and changes. Then you get a sense that he was never satisfied. He never finished with his poem. So therefore, he would never say, "Okay, I'm done. Publish these poems." That's part of it.
I would say also adding to that that it was part, I think, of his own strategy to promote himself. He wanted to, so when we say he didn't publish the work, he published many times individual poems in periodicals and magazines, but he never, and then he circulated them either individually in what are called feuilles volantes, or like floating poems, or in little pamphlets or booklets. And I think it was because he never wanted to give his work a sense of an end, that it was complete. He wanted to intervene in the market in a sense by creating a valuable good, by controlling access to the valuable good. So everybody had to write to him. We have letters in the archive, people writing from Germany or France. Mr. Cavafy, I read your poem. I went to the bookstore, but I can't find your poems anywhere. Could you send me some? So this was part of his trying to win one reader at a time. And in a sense, it's for this reason is that he became, in a sense, viral before his time, because he had a different conception of virality here, and that he wanted to control the market. He wanted to the extent that he could, the readership and the reception of his work. Only, of course, until he lived. Once he died, that was it. But that initial control was influential in the way that his poetry was received, consumed, promoted, interpreted, and reinterpreted.
Thank you. We have a question from Vasilis Sotiropoulos, who is asking if you used, at any stage of research, of writing the book, if you used AI.
No, no,
No, I mean, AI was not even,
it wasn't even
the
there.
book was
No.
finished.
I cannot go through the archives, through the letters, through the shopping list, right? I mean, that
Well,
would be.
our AI doesn't have access
Uh-huh.
to them all, does it? And I don't know.
I mean, it would be interesting to let
Mhm,
AI do a biography and see what would come out. That would
mhm,
that would, I think, be a curious exercise. And as Gregory says, I mean, the trend hadn't caught on, and we had completed the work prior to that.
mhm,
I mean, I think there are places where it could be used, to go through some of the manuscripts and gather things, but no, we
Could it
resisted
read?
that.
Could AI read his mother's handwriting, Peter? No.
Mhm.
No, it couldn't do
Thank
that
God,
sort of
right? Thank God,
interpretative work.
the
Yeah, no.
obstacles.
I mean,
I know.
yeah,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Let's
I'm
do.
mindful of your time. I know that you have to leave. And before you go, Professor Jusdanis, I just want to repeat the message from Luis Anastas, your former student. He just sent a comment. He says, I wanted to say I'm very excited to dive into this biography. I love the thematic approach. I know little about Cavafy, but feel this is an ideal place to start. So thank you for taking this on. And of course, he's a very big fan of Professor Jusdanis, who taught me modern Greek in the late 1980s at Ohio State. His energy has always stayed with me. Luis Anastas, from
Thank you, Louis. And
your
it just
former
shows
self.
you how old I am and getting so. Unfortunately, I have a Zoom meeting with an advisory group at 2 o'clock, so I will leave, but you all can continue. I want to thank then Christina for this kind invitation and to all you all for tuning in at this time and for your very thoughtful questions.
Well,
Thank you so much.
thank you so much for being with us. Um, I won't take too much of Peter's time either. I just have a final question in closing. What do you hope the readers, both long-time admirers of Cavafy and newcomers, right, will take away from your book?
Well, the idea that we've humanized him and that, a couple of people in Greece particularly have made the point that this is the first time they feel that they get to know the human being, because Gaddafi is an intimidating idea. He's become, the flip side to his fame and global popularity is that somehow um, you lose touch of the artist and the suffering person there and the human being. So we hope, I hope, and Gregory, we both share this. I think that you feel an intimacy with the person as you read the biography, that you discover things that you perhaps hadn't thought about before, and you understand how he got to be Cavafy. That's why we use the word Constantine so much because we really want to refer to the person behind the myth and the idea. So that's one thing I hope people take away.
Great. Well, again, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for this engaging conversation, offering
And,
us this compelling new portrait of Constantine Cavafy, the man.
and
Uh,
I thank you for inviting us to do this. This was a wonderful opportunity. And to all the people online who have followed this, thank you for your interest in the topic.
Thank you so much. And in closing, of course, I want to thank our audience for joining us today. I hope you will read the book. It's published by Macmillan, and you can find it everywhere online. So thank you all, and I hope we will see you soon at one of our next events. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you.